Welcome. My name is Kara. I coordinate Kentuckians for Energy Democracy. I'm based in Lexington, Kentucky, and excited to have you all here for our final webinar in our expert webinar series co-hosted with RMI. And today's topic is going to be transmission planning. I'm very excited, like I said, to have three experts here with us. And Claire, I'll just hand it over to you to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Yeah, super excited to have this panel of three experts with us today. My name is Claire Weiner. I'm a senior associate at RMI on our carbon-free electricity program, and I specialize in all things transmission policy. So I'm going to kick things off with a couple, just two brief introductory slides, and then I'll pass it to our panelists to give some opening remarks to share key content, and then we'll hop into Q&A and hopefully a robust discussion based off of what our panelists share. So just confirming that you all can see my screen. All right. Great. So just a map to kick things off. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but this is a map of different balancing authorities in Kentucky. So balancing authorities are regions responsible for maintaining reliability within their footprint. And the reason why I chose a map of balancing authorities to talk about transmission is because depending on the type of balancing authority, whether it's a utility or an RTO, a regional transmission organization, some of these entities conduct what is known as regional transmission planning and some do not. So two of the entities shown on the screen, MISO, Mid-Continent ISO, which is in black on the left, and PJM in gray on the right. These are both regional transmission organizations or RTOs. So they conduct regional transmission planning. They have a footprint that extends far beyond Kentucky. So PJM spans eastward from Kentucky all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, so encompassing a lot of other mid-Atlantic states. So they conduct transmission planning for that entire footprint. And then on the northwestern part of the state, MISO spans a lot of the rest of the Midwest, so going up as far north as the border with Canada and actually as far south as the Louisiana Gulf region. So MISO is responsible for regional transmission planning for that footprint. And then the two other colors represent utilities that are both a part of SRTEP, which in the bottom right I've noted is the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning region. So SRTEP is not an RTO, but they are still responsible for regional transmission planning across their footprint, which covers the rest of the Southeast. So excluding Florida, but including states like Georgia and a lot of the Carolinas, um, and other parts of the Southeast. So both of those utilities, so we have LG&E KU in green, they are a part of SRTEP. And then so is TVA. LG&E KU is a private investor-owned utility, while TVA is a federal utility. Both of these entities technically participate in SRTEP, although I will note that TVA is not FERC jurisdictional, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so federally jurisdictional. So I believe some of our panelists could probably speak to this in more detail, but my understanding is that TVA's participation in SRTEP is voluntary just to kind of facilitate coordination across the southeastern region. Um, all of these different planning regions, so SRTEP, MISO, and PJM are federally jurisdictional, or they obliged by FERC regulations, and were the regional transmission framework was actually created by FERC back in 2011 with Order Number 1000. So just one other quick slide before we hop into our panelist content. Several layers of transmission that we're going to be talking about today. So just to familiarize you with these terms, we have local transmission, which is planned and built by a single utility to meet its own needs within its own service territory. Then we have regional transmission, which is what I was just referring to on the previous slide. So it's planned by that regional planning entity, MISO, PJM, or CERTIP, to meet those regional needs. I will note that regional transmission projects are frequently identified in MISO and PJM, but to my knowledge, CERTIP has yet to identify a single regional transmission project. So some of our panelists can probably speak a little bit more to how regional transmission planning is or isn't done currently in the Southeast planning region. And then interregional transmission is planned by multiple regional planning entities to span their different footprints and to meet needs that span those regions. I will say that interregional transmission, based on this map and all the different boundaries in Kentucky, could be of particular interest to Kentucky, but to date, interregional transmission planning has been pretty limited just because of a host of different hurdles, which our panelists can speak to more, that make it difficult to conduct that planning across different entities. But that doesn't mean it still isn't important, right? It can still lead to a lot of cost efficiencies for ratepayers. So with that, let's hop into the discussion. So first, we're going to hear from Michael Haggerty from the Brattle Group, and he's going to share more about a study that they did on the benefits of regional transmission planning to the Southeast. Then we're going to hear from Kent Chandler from the R Street Institute, but formerly with the Kentucky PSC and before that with the Kentucky Consumer Advocate, who will share more all about his experience with transmission in Kentucky, including local transmission and the different types of planning and how they interact or don't interact. And then finally, we'll hear from Ted Thomas with Energized Strategies, who's formerly with the Arkansas PSC, and can bring that out of state former commissioner perspective on the importance of states engaging more with regional transmission. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it to Michael. Kick us off.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks to you and K40V for inviting me today. My name is Mike Haggerty. I'm a principal in our DC office for the Brattle Group. We work on improving transmission planning across the country. We've done work in PJM and MISO, but also up in the Northeast, out West. So this was a really great opportunity to dive into. It can sometimes be quite the black box of Southeast transmission planning. One fun tip about me in Kentucky is that I haven't been many times, but the two most recent times I've been to Gethsemane Abbey, south of Louisville. My dad's cousin is a monk there, so I've enjoyed trips out to see him. It's an interesting mix of bourbon and monks when I travel out there. So now I can, as I drive through, think about the map that Claire just showed. But thanks to Clean Grid Initiative and these other organizations, they asked us to look at regional transmission planning around the across the Southeast. That, as Claire talked about, is a LGKU is a part of. So just want to touch on a few. Why is there a need to start off with transmission? Why is there a need in the Southeast? Why is there a need across the country? But what we've seen specifically in the Southeast, including Kentucky, is that we're already investing a lot of money in transmission. There's been a 4x increase in transmission costs and transmission investments over the last 20 years. So utilities are already doing this, but it's almost fully due to local planning and for reliability purposes. So at the Brattle Group, we're power system economists who like to think about not just the cost, but the value of transmission. So we see this as a really opportunity to increase the value of where you plan. And that is even more important going forward because we have a 25% increase, 20 gigawatts across the Southeast, which is a very significant load growth coming. And to serve that load, we're going to need 80 gigawatts of new generation based on the recent resource plans across the Southeast. So you got 20 gigawatts, you're already investing, you got 20 gigawatts of load coming, 80 gigawatts. That's going to change up the flows across the power system and the transmission that you need. And on top of that, we have increased severity of winter storms. So that we see under these conditions, and over the last 20 years of working on this, a need to improve transmission planning. It's not just us saying it, we've seen national studies for the Southeast saying that this is important. So as I mentioned, most of that's coming out of local planning, and there's been no progress of planning on a regional basis, and for Kentucky, as you saw on that map, interregional. So we think this is a really important part of the toolkit to supplement the local upgrades. You will always need local upgrades depending on the exact location of generation and load, but there's a broad middle of transmission that's being missed by not having a robust regional transmission planning process. Give you a map of what CERTIP looks like. You can see the map in the top right here with Kentucky, the parts of Kentucky that are in CERTIP in blue. So that's an organization that's really there to meet FERC requirements. You can see it expands a large area, so at the northern end, but also importantly up against PJM and MISO. So just a few points on what we've seen about the CERTIP process. It's currently, in our view, insufficient to meet the needs of the future. It's limited in scope. It's only really pulling together one future scenario across all those utilities. Once they pulled that together, they have not yet actually identified any regional needs. One reason for this is that the planning that they're doing is not actually consistent with what the utilities are saying that they need from their resource planning. So this figure on the right here, I think, is really instructive of one of the challenges. The resource plans by 2035 across these four major utilities in Southeast are saying you need 80 gigawatts of new generation. And these studies, these 10-year-out studies that the transmission planners do, it shows up on the right about how much of that new generation is actually in those models. And so that's only 12%. So they essentially aren't actually planning for the future that is coming by their own resource planning studies. So that is a real problem to do effective and identify least cost transmission, accounting for not just the transmission system, but what can do in the system. It's hard to get into the planning studies and identify what needs to change due to the lack of transparency. And I know Kent's going to talk more about that in a little bit. So we see that there's a need for transmission, as I mentioned. The current approach is not working. And I just want to highlight one of those recent studies that they've done to show how it's not working. So stakeholders can request studies from CERTIP to study different flows across the system. And there was a major request this past year in 2024 for a 10 gigawatt transfer across the system. And the bottom left here shows all of the constraints, all the violations, all the challenges. And a lot of this is not in Kentucky's area. Sorry, I was in Tennessee last week talking about this. So not in Kentucky's area, but it shows that there's a lot of issues. All these pink overloads their problems. So then they propose 3 lines as potential solutions to the right, which would be a major upgrade. They're identifying $4.6 billion of cost to resolve this. However, you can see the $4.6 billion of cost here. Their analysis showed zero value of building these lines, zero. And that's the reason is they only look at whether those major regional upgrades avoid local upgrades. And through our analysis, which was high level, but to demonstrate the value here, we found over $8 billion of value for these lines. So their current approach just isn't studying, the real needs of the system. And then when they do an analysis, it's coming up with zero benefits where our back of the envelope found significant benefits. So we've got some recommendations for how this can be improved. There's things that we think they can do today to increase transparency, engage state commissions, bring in new alternatives, least cost alternatives to resolve some of these issues. But they also need new capabilities. So this is our second set of recommendations about creating better scenarios to plan for the future, better models, and the ability to analyze a comprehensive set of cost savings and other benefits of transmission. Because right now they're only looking at avoiding local upgrades. And finally, once you have those capabilities, you need a better process to do so. So just one thing that we're doing right now is helping down in the Carolinas. Claire mentioned that that's a part of CERTIP. at a local level there in the Carolinas, they're doing a study that actually accounts for the future resource needs. And they found a lot of issues. That's what you see, kind of similar to those pink marks on the previous map. You have all these red marks. And by putting in future resource needs, they're finding constraints, and they're now going through the process to prioritize those and find least cost, highest value solutions. So that's a multi-value strategic transmission approach that's going on in the Carolinas that we're hoping really bears some good fruit here. The last thing I want to note before turning it over is that Order 1920 gives us a great opportunity here to implement better processes. So it's a time where the Southeast is being required now by FERC to do long-term 20 plus years studies that account for multiple values, multiple needs, and coordinating across the region. So we think this is a real hopeful step, but just like something like the MBST, it really comes down to how it's implemented. We've seen lots of planning approaches, even when they're satisfying the requirements, go wrong, not identify sufficiently identified needs. So this is something to be aware of and something to participate in if that's something that you're focused on. So just want to leave you with that there's some hope for the future here under FERC Order 1920, but there's certainly work to be done. And that is all I have to start us off here.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike. That was super informative, really helpful. I'm going to pass it to Kent next to build on that, talk about his Kentucky specific experience.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And I don't want anybody to take away that Ted and I and Michael are well, Ted and Michael certainly are experts, or the only folks here that can't speak to this. Claire's certainly an expert, so we appreciate Claire the work that you've done in putting this together, and frankly the work you've done out of this to highlight some of the issues that we see in Kentucky, but on a broader scale. Also, I guess I was here to provide the Kentucky flavor, but that was before I knew Michael had had Kentucky connections, anyways, which reminds me to remind everybody else. Please, this is the time to order your bourbon fudge for friends and family for the holidays from our Trappist friends in Central Kentucky. Yeah, thank you all for having me. I'm glad that a few of you don't have a hearing today, or at least have a break from the hearing today, to be able to join us. And hope that this is helpful and informative. The study that Brattle did was really helpful to illustrate the disconnect between largely what is supposed to be happening and what is frankly happening in other areas of the country, and what is not happening in reality in the Southeast. I do want to recount a story that I think is indicative of the more detailed study that Michael and his peers at Brattle did that may be helpful to illustrate these issues for folks here in Kentucky. Most everyone on this call is aware of the LG&E and KU's 2022 CPCN for new generation, their interest in retiring generation that ended up having to get refiled in 2023 when the law was changed to require the utilities to actually seek formal approval to retire some power plants in addition to seeking approval to build new ones. Most of you all are aware that as a result of that case, the Public Service Commission in November of 2023 approved the retirement of a couple of coal-fired power plants, and approved either the purchasing of power from some renewable generation in addition to building some solar facilities and building a gas combined cycle power plant. All of that was approved in the first week of November. I think later this week will be the 2-year anniversary of it. I had the benefit of attending a CERTEP meeting the following June, my final week as a commissioner at the Public Service Commission. The final, I think it was maybe June 27th, June 28th, something like that. A CERTEP meeting in Louisville. And as a sitting commissioner, I attended and listened to all the utilities in the Southeast talk about any changes that they had made to their models, and any changes they had made to the topography of the system. So whether that be generation that they expected to retire, generation that they expected to come online sometime during the planning period, any changes that would affect the possibility of identifying additional needs or negating previously identified needs. I was interested to hear some of the other utilities, especially some of the utilities in the Carolinas, identified additions to resources in a model that they wanted to make sure showed up or that were considered. And most of those were resources that they had either proposed or intended to propose as additions in their what is effectively now their integrated resource plan. It's technically called something different now, but it's their version of an IRP. And then, so it was interesting that those are projects that they think that they will have a need for, and they believe are the best ways to meet those needs pursuant to their state public policies. And they included that generation so that it could be appropriately studied. And then we got to Kentucky, where the only addition to the topology or the change to the generation was a merchant generator that had gone through the process in Kentucky, the siting board process, and ultimately gotten approval to interconnect to the system. And I asked if the combined cycle that had been approved to be built pursuant to the commission's order to give them a certificate of public convenience and necessity that had been included, and whether the retirements to the coal generation were included. And they let me know that although it had been 7 or 8 months since the commission had actually approved the building of that power plant or the other generation decisions, and even though that those projects had received a CPC and gotten an interconnection queue position and approval through that queue position of a interconnection service agreement, that it was not included because it hadn't sought this additional step that they've decided to add to the process. Even though the commission had told them to build it and that it was planned on being built. So this would have been June of 2024 that they anticipate that combined cycle has an in-service date of 2027. When they were going to run their models in 2024, the models weren't going to show an expected combined cycle over that planning period. And that's a generator that not only has been proposed to be approved, but had actually been approved and is going to be operating, is going to be transmitting generation across the system's electricity system. So it's not just that the utilities in the Southeast are running their models in a way that's inconsistent with what they expect to do in their integrated resource plans, or that their commissions expect them to do in integrated resource plans. The models are actually being run without generation included in them that has already been approved by the commissions, that is being built and is expected to be online in a matter of years. And the issue with that is you're lying to yourself. What you're doing is ensuring that the system that you're looking at or the system that you're modeling is actually inconsistent with the one that you expect to operate. And by not being able to factually identify issues in advance, you're unable to more efficiently meet those needs in ways different than the utilities propose. And that's the big thing that I want to sort of get across today is that the process that the utilities use in Kentucky, especially the non-RTO utilities, the process that they use today that they go through effectively results in the proposals that they have being the only ones that can timely meet needs. And that negates the opportunities that federalized processes or larger processes were intended to fix. In the Southeast, and Michael covered this a little bit, I just want to make it clear in the Southeast, the benefits that would occur from regionally planned transmission is negating the need for smaller utility-driven projects. But if the smaller utility-driven projects are never included to be considered to be avoided, then the avoidance is always of $0, right? Doesn't mean they're not going to build those smaller local projects. It just means that they're not available in the process to be considered to be negated or militated against. And what that results in is basically whatever the utilities want to do, they get. And that wouldn't be a problem, except that it is a massive issue. It wouldn't be a problem if the entire utility business model wasn't premised around maximizing available investments and then making those investments in order to earn a return, right? There's a capital bias that utilities have to make investments. And so we need more transparency. We need additional state-run processes. And what you need to negate that inherent bias is to have some additional input from, I say additional input. You need the transparency to occur so that you have enough foresight in either with both information and time to figure out if there are better ways to do something either within that individual utility territory or across utility territories to meet needs in a more holistic manner. This is the idea of IRPs. And the problem is just in terms of how the process has actually led to be has actually eventually been done. IRPs lack the sort of process and insight into how needs are even identified, never mind how solutions are created to meet those needs. That it's not an effective tool in the way that it's being done in Kentucky. And so before we move on to Ted, who I know has some great insight between retail and wholesale interactions. I want to throw out that like the solutions start at home. It's great that FERC has these requirements to do proactive transmission planning on a broader basis. That only works when the utilities, since transmission planning is sort of top down and bottoms up, it only works well when the utilities are doing appropriate, transparent, bottoms up planning that you have some transparency into, so that wholesale projects or that larger projects can more efficiently meet those needs. And so that starts from overhauling state IRP processes. And it starts at just requiring the utility commission to exert additional oversight to figure out how utilities are coming up with the answers to begin with. So I'll get into that in a little bit later, but I'll just point out that there's effectively zero insight into how LG&E and KU come up with their local planning criteria, what their local planning criteria is, and how it's implemented. And that is not the case for the utilities that are in RTOs. There is, although it leaves a lot to leaves a lot more to be desired. There is, it's almost diametrically opposed to the lack of insight and transparency that we have into LG&E KU. Every year, utilities in PJM, for instance, which in Kentucky would be Duke, East Kentucky Power, and Kentucky Power. Every year, those utilities in December have to show up and identify exactly what their planning criteria is. They have to explain how they came to consider that planning criteria, how they plan on implementing that planning criteria, and then every time the utilities come forward with a transmission owner-initiated transmission project, they have to identify which transmission planning criteria they can tie that back to. We don't have any insight into LG&E KU's planning criteria, and we have no idea how they're coming up with needs and how they're coming up with the solutions to meet those needs. And there's no form in which that information can be sought. So I just put it out there. It's not as if the federal rules are necessarily broken. It's the implementation of what we have today, and the lack of state-driven insight that leads us to sort of be in the dark on how our biggest utilities are coming up with transmission projects.
Thanks, Kent. That's super insightful. Just a quick follow-up question before I pass it to Ted. On that last bit on LG&E KU, given that a lot of this is federally jurisdictional, right? Just to double down, what do you think the role of Kentucky at a state level, like the PSC, could do to enhance transparency for LG&E, KU, and CERTEP planning?
You're muted.
Thanks. Thank you. I would say the first thing is every utility in Kentucky should have to file their local transmission planning criteria with the Public Service Commission. And I think the PSC should consider affirmatively approving or maybe even assuming approval unless disapproval is expressed would be a great start. Right. That is effectively, although they're required to have it pursuant to FERC rules, the FERC rules are basically deferring to the utilities to come up with their own local transmission planning criteria. And implicit, maybe even now that I think about it, explicit in that is that planning criteria is subject to state PUC oversight or state regulatory oversight. And so that would be the first place I'd start. I'd make them identify their planning criteria and then subject that planning criteria to some oversight by the PUC. And then alongside that, I would consider requiring the utilities to identify how they plan to apply that criteria or how they've applied that criteria to actually come up with transmission planning needs and to file those on a transparent basis at some sort of period. Now, I will say there is a docket somewhere at the Public Service Commission deep in the bowels uh, of a basement that it's not actually in the basement, it's somewhere on the first floor. But there is a docket that exists at the commission where jurisdictional utilities every year have to file some like 10-year plan and what they plan to do over that 10-year period. But that is neither a transparent process or one that actually the commission has any oversight into. They just give the resulting projects. And they do that under the cover of confidentiality. And it's not clear actually how they come up with any of those projects. The issue is not having oversight over a CPCN. Commission has plenty of oversight over the vast majority of projects, unless it's a low voltage low voltage transmission project, or it's a complete wreck and rebuild, which means that they're tearing down a power line and they're going to rebuild it at the exact same voltage along the exact same right of way. The commission has plenty of CPCN oversight. The issue is not saying yes or no to a project. The issue is understanding and having some oversight or approval over how the utility identifies needs before they ever start trying to figure out what the best way to meet those needs are. And it's that lack of input into identifying needs and addressing those needs that is the real problem. Waiting until the commission is just in a place to say thumbs up or thumbs down to a very particular project, it's too late. And so including that in a separate process or including that sort of that level of oversight over needs identification in the IRP is the place that I would start. The problem is that the IRP is basically well, that's a whole nother conversation, but the IRP is not well positioned today to take on this additional work until the entire IRP rule is completely overhauled.
Well, we won't dive into IRPs, at least quite now. Yeah, as Kara said, let's have that conversation in our next webinar series. Endless things to talk about. But with that, I want to pass it to Ted to close us out with these prepared remarks. These have been great.
I'm Ted Thomas. My Kentucky connection is that one of my earliest memories, we lived in Lexington, and my 4th birthday was when they launched the moon landing. They didn't land on the moon, but they launched the rocket that took them to the moon in 1969. We lived in Lexington. So my role here is to talk about my experience, the state of Arkansas, which is in 2 RTOs, and why we would do such a thing. Why would we give up jurisdiction to something that was related federally and headquartered perhaps in some faraway place when we can do it all ourselves? Why would we do that? Why do we share resources is the first key question. And the first answer to that is because you save money when you do that. Electric energy is really 2 products. It's unlike other stuff. You buy a gallon of milk, put your money on a table, you walk out with your milk, and that's it. There's nothing else. With electric energy, you also have to pay to make sure that there's enough steel in the ground so that you can use as much as you want whenever you want. It's built to a peak that's usually in the summer. But when you think about when that peak happens, that's when you're using almost everything. You look at all the other 11 months of the year when you're not almost using everything, you have to pay for all that stuff 365 days a year. No, you're not using it. So we call that capacity. It's necessary so there's not a line. You don't wait in line. You don't turn on your light switch and have a little red number counting down. And when you're done with the line, on it comes. So having enough capacity is an engineering question, and I'm going to oversimplify this a little bit, built around the single largest contingency in your system. We engineer the system so if the single largest contingency fails, the system still works. And it's usually the single largest power plant, or sometimes it's the single largest transmission line. So if that goes out, we still want the system to run. So that is an oversimplification on how they calculate that, but that is the key part. So if you take Kentucky, what is the single largest contingency? Whatever it is, pretend Kentucky is all one, well, it is all one state, but all one utility. What's the single largest? And that would give you that would be a key component of deciding what we call your reserve margin, which is how much you need on hand. Now, if you added any state that borders Kentucky to the mix, what would happen to you say it was Ohio. Then you'd have Kentucky and Ohio. What's the single largest contingency? And that as a percentage of the system is a key component in your reserve margin. By definition, when you add geography to the reserve margin calculation, the cost of your reserve margin goes down. It's savings. So that's the capacity. The other part of the product is energy, which you see kilowatt hours that your meter spinning. The other you see quotas like megawatts as opposed to megawatt hours. One is capacity, the other is energy. Well, how does that work? Well, we have a system where we dispatch. It's called economic dispatch, security constrained economic dispatch, to make sure there's sufficient transmission to get the power where we want it to go. And what you do, and you got to remember, it's variable cost only, that when load ramps up based on variable cost only, you turn on the cheapest available stuff that's not already running. And as your load ramps up, you follow it up with what you can turn on. Of course, you've already layered in the stuff that you can't turn on or off. And as the load ramps down, you reduce the most expensive all the way down. And this is called economic dispatch. So again, if you take Kentucky and you're running, you got your supply and demand, and always have to be balanced. Then there's a new load. Somebody turns something on. What you will do is you will look across the state of Kentucky, if it was all one utility, and find the cheapest single resource and use that one to serve that new load. And if your load goes down, you'll turn off. So again, if you combine Kentucky and Ohio, when you're looking for the single cheapest thing, if you've got a larger area to look, some of the time you're going to save money. So that's why we share. Is the first is to save money, and it's through the two key things are capacity, the reserve margin calculation, and energy through the economic dispatch. But it's also important to remember when it's variable cost only. If we're taking a trip to somewhere and we wanted to take the cheapest form of transportation, and you had a 2020 Toyota Celica that gets 38 miles to the gallon, and a 2026 Mercedes hybrid that gets 40 miles to the gallon, which is cheaper? Well, if you're looking at only fuel savings, the Mercedes is cheaper. So economic dispatch would pick the Mercedes, not the Toyota Celica, even if all in cost, it would be obviously cheaper to drive the Toyota. But those are sunk costs. We've already paid them, so we don't put them in our economic dispatch. So that's the first key reason, is we save money. And is $50 million on just the energy side was the average in Arkansas. So it's $50 million that comes in the MISO area, not the other area, that encompasses probably 65% of the state, and it was every year. So, that's $50 million for regulators. A negative number in a rate case is, I love you, it feels different this time. That's a big deal. There's a second reason also that Michael referenced, which is transparency. You have a market. Some people say, well, we don't have a market. Well, you do have a market. It's called the bilateral market. It's when a utility needs something, and they call their neighbor and say, hey, how you doing? You got some extra power. And when you do that for 50 years, you kind of know what causes you to have to do that. And it might be the weather does this, or it might be this unit is down. And you just, over time, you build up this relationship and you call on the phone. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, nobody else gets to see what the price is. Nobody else that might want to sell knows what the price is. And then nobody else looking around that might want to buy knows what the price is. So what you do have a market, it's just a disorganized market that's more like selling your house. You meet the person, typically you meet the person you buy a house from. It's a single house. There's not, but when you have a market, everybody sells into the market and all the buyers show up and everybody can see what's going on. It's more like transacting on eBay than buying a house. So when you see price, when buyers and sellers can see price, then they can think about what transactions I might be able to do. And then all of a sudden you're planning to save money, not just doing this local relationship like they do in the bilateral market. So what's that had to do with transmission? Well, transmission is the reach for all of this stuff. What you can buy and what you can sell, whether it's capacity or energy, depends on the transmission grid. And so the key planning criteria, in my view, that's often missing is counting economic savings towards transmission. And to me, this is one of the key benefits. How they typically plan it, and this is again oversimplified. They say we're going to build a power plant here. Okay, now we're going to string a line out to it that's big enough to make sure that the power can make it to the grid. There's a better way to do that when you look at the entire system and you figure out if we build this here, we'll enable all of these market transactions that come in as a savings. And that's what we've done in RTO world. There's been a lot of investment, which costs ratepayers money. But when you invest in transmission, it's also supported by a study that shows your cost benefit ratio, which means you've saved money by building transmission on generation. And there's studies that back that up. And of course, if you can build out your grid with generation savings, then you have a more robust grid and you're better prepared when something like Winter Storm Elliott comes along. So the two key reasons of why we share is one, you save money, and second, when you have a market like that, there's transparency, so more people can see. And then when you have all of this information, that becomes the basis for good planning, so you can build out the grid to capture these savings. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that, Ted. Those analogies were super helpful, I think, for creating good context for why this is important for Kentucky. Um, to that end, I want to open it up to our attendees. Feel free to put questions that you have in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom if you'd prefer to ask your question live. As we wait for those to come in, I'll go ahead and ask a question about a topic that I think is important, but we haven't necessarily touched on in detail, which is interregional transmission. As we saw on that map that I showed, Kentucky has so many different regions and geographies when it comes to transmission planning. Would be curious to hear any of your perspectives on how you think we can get those regions to talk to each other better to maximize efficiencies for Kentucky ratepayers. So on the note of interregional, or if you've seen good examples of interregional planning done elsewhere in the US.
Yeah. So a couple of things. So first, I'll say interregional planning, or at least there's really okay. So take this out. Whatever, largely, a lot of the interregional planning that happens today is trying to find more efficient ways to meet regional needs than the current regional transmission planning process does. Trying to find a way to, um, negate the need for more expensive or less efficient regional projects. That is the process that already exists today for regional planning in the Southeast. The issue is when you're not finding regional needs, it makes it easier or it makes it harder to do the interregional stuff in the Southeast. That's a long way of saying there are a lot of opportunities here. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. There's a lot of opportunities, especially in Kentucky, given the significant amount of overlap between utilities. You have load in Kentucky that is technically, in PJM that's being served off of the LG&E and KU transmission system. You have load in the LG&E KU non-RTO Southeast that's being served off of the East Kentucky Power transmission system, which is part of PJM. We have a lot of free-flowing interconnections in Kentucky between utilities that are technically in different regions. And being able to, or having the opportunity to take into account the varying needs of multiple utilities just because they happen to be in different regions aside, but being able to take those different needs into account and trying to plan them holistically is a real opportunity to both increase reliability and decrease costs. So I just throw that out there, and I'm interested in sort of the technical perspectives that Michael or the experience that Ted have. But I think Kentucky is chock full of opportunities in the regional front. And I frankly think that there are ways that the state could take actions that is technically interregional planning without sitting around and waiting for Congress or FERC to require some federalized interregional planning processes.
Yeah, the amount of interregional has been hard across the country. And a lot of the thing that's hard is really understanding the value. Where's the need for this? What will this change? Can we actually utilize this? So I think, but in Kentucky, from that map, it's clear that local upgrades are really also interregional. We think of these kind of as stacked, but you're so intertwined in this area that it becomes even more important. So I think identifying, for the utilities within Kentucky, what's missing? What are we doing that is causing our ratepayers higher costs because we are not sufficiently analyzing the need for lines that interact between LG, KU, PJM, as well as MISO, I think is really something to identify and say that there's something missing here and it's causing our ratepayers money that we could resolve otherwise. Where we have seen it be done well is along the MISO SPP seam, which I think Ted knows well, especially in the wind-rich area out in the Midwest. There's something called the JTIQ, the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue process. So that you can confirm what the queue is there, Ted. But that's really important because if there's resources that need to be built along these seams, it makes it really challenging to interconnect to new resources, which is important, especially if you've got load growth in Kentucky. I remember seeing that there's significant industrialization going on in Kentucky. When you add new generation, you need to study kind of all the impacts on all those local entities, which can be very challenging. So something that's targeted and supporting economic development, something like a JTIQ process, I think is a potential low-hanging fruit for how to improve that, as well as understanding the benefits that Ted was talking about for sharing, what's the impact of all these flows on your system for resource planning and reserve margins. So the resource adequacy is the term we use to talk about that. That value of interregional ties for resource adequacy is not well understood, and it's something we're actually working on in Brattle right now. So I feel like those are all areas that interregional can be really important here in Kentucky.
Yeah. Interregional, the first thing you have to do is define your region. And when we're talking about this, the basic unit is the balancing authority. So MISO and SPP are both entirely their own balancing authority. So interregional there, isn't between two states in MISO, it's between both regions. Now in Kentucky, where we have this little bit of everything with two RTOs and some not with no RTO, and then TVA, interregion is really because they have separate balancing authorities are those things. Now, how they're typically within the balancing authority, what your planning is you plan to not having what's called a NERC violation. Now, NERC is the National Electric Reliability Council, and it's usually in terms of heat. A line overheats. So they run a model, and if the line overheats, now we got to do something to upgrade. Now, how you capture value by interregional planning is there might be three little problems in each of your regions and one large solution that would cost less than the three problems that would solve all of them. And then perhaps have other benefits like the economic dispatch benefits or capacity because it enables more transactions. So that's what Kent referenced. When you scale up and solve multiple problems across the region with one asset that costs more than any of the local solutions, but when you add all of the local solutions together, the scaled up costs less. That's one of the key benefits that we're trying to achieve in 1920. But
Yeah.
when you have four different areas, or is it five? Can't where there's lots of opportunity. All of it's planned together in MISO and SPP. So all of that kind of happens over at the RTO level. When you don't have that, there's stuff that hasn't been looked at, which means there's probably low hanging fruit out there getting this done. And then there was an IRP question. Um,
Yeah, I can take that, Ted.
okay, okay.
The Thanks for the question, Wallace. I think this demonstrates kind of you think of them as as one utility, but they're really different entities within that utility that is not, following a similar process. So, I don't know if it means that I think it means that they don't take their IRP seriously for transmission planning purposes. As I think Ted mentioned, the transmission planners really see their North Star as the NERC requirements. And they are attempting to solve the problem that their new assumptions in their model create for them. And their job is to solve that, right? It's not really their problem to ask, are those the right inputs into the model? And I think that's what something like 1920 is trying to resolve, is having the right assumptions into this model. Because currently, and this is even true in a place like PJM, that a lot of their long-term planning is only including existing generation and new generation with an interconnection agreement, and not thinking about what additional resources are going to be coming online in the future that meets the future load. So this is a significant change in mindset for transmission planners, and we see that this is hard. You have a lot of people that are engineers solving a specific problem that are not used to thinking about value, not used about thinking different scenarios, because that's not what NERC tells them to do. So it's really requires some leadership on the transmission planner side as well as the utilities in order to say, we need to do this in a different way, not just to meet NERC requirements. We need to keep doing that, but also deliver value through the offset of the generation costs that Ted was talking about, the lower cost dispatch, less generation needed for resource adequacy, and the generation that you do add being lower cost.
Yeah,
And I think,
and now,
go ahead,
oh,
Ted.
go ahead, Ted.
One thing that I would add to that, and you often get this thing, well, if we're sharing, then we're taking a chance. Because if our neighbor doesn't have enough, well, then what are we going to do? Well, but that's not true because you plan to what you need. So you always have enough. But then as soon as you plan to what you need, knowing that you've planned to a single peak or a calculation of a peak, then it's what can you do for the cheapest resource when you're not at peak and save money running somebody else's resource, even while you retain your resources. So if things are tight, you always have enough. And of course, again, transmission links all of that together. And to Michael's point, not just with NERC violations, but to try to save money, to try to drive economic benefits, because it's magic in the forest when you can build out the grid with generation savings. You're getting a more robust grid that you have to pay for, but you've got a study that says, yeah, I paid more for transmission, but I saved even more on generation because I invested in that transmission. And then when the big storm hits, you have a more robust grid.
Yeah, I'll also just say, well, it's good to see you. That IRPs are different in every state throughout that entire transmission planning area in the Southeast. And so in some of the states, the IRPs, like in Kentucky, aren't necessarily reflective of what the utilities actually plan to do, right? We know that from the 2021 LG&E-KU IRP that a non-abated combined cycle wasn't even a resource that was included as something the model would choose. And then a year and a half later, they're in seeking a CPC in for two of them. So in some of those places, yeah, they don't take it seriously. In some of the others, an IRP is actually formally approved by the commission. Georgia is a great example of this, where once the commission approves a formal sort of plan that comes out of the IRP, that is effectively the green light for the utility to go ahead and build those things. And so the first thing is IRPs mean different things in different areas of the country. The carbon plans in North Carolina are another sort of variation of that. But separately from that, It's in the utilities benefit to not necessarily change the models or update the models that are used for regional planning to reflect what they actually anticipate doing. Because if they plan to go ahead and build all this generation and whatever transmission might go along with it in terms of their local planning processes and at the state level, if they include it in their regional plan or if they include it in their regional models, they run the risk of finding more efficient ways to meet those needs, which actually goes to undermine their investment opportunities to otherwise build the things they were anticipating building. Like there's a real risk. And so this is where you require or need state sort of this is actually the part where you require a strong FERC to actually ensure that utilities are complying with the expectations of processes or requirements like Order 1000, where they're supposed to be trying to find the literal purpose of Order 1000 is to more efficiently and more effectively plan the transmission system than utilities doing it on a piecemeal basis, right? And so this is you just require regulatory intervention at this point. Of it's not even intervention, just regulators stepping in and requiring utilities to do what they were supposed to do to begin with. So it's not necessarily them not taking it seriously; it's just them not carrying it forward to the other processes that they're supposed to. And that's my opinion. I'm sure Brattle's not as interested in sort of going on that limb, but I think they correctly identify the disconnect. And then it's up to policymakers to figure out what they can do to try to either acknowledge or figure out why there's a disconnect, and then figure out how they're going to bridge it to make sure that it's less than it was.
That one thing to add to that, something I meant to say before, I think one of our recommendations is state commissions be more involved. The fact that Kent is the only state commissioner joining CERTIP calls, and the only one that we saw when we were attending them is pretty wild. But wherever we have seen proactive regional transmission planning be successful, it's really been driven by the states. So I've seen other places in the Southeast where, the utility tries to make clear walls. That's FERC, that's not you guys. Don't worry about it. Um, but when the state commission says this affects our rates because transmission affects our generation costs and the eventual rate. So you need to go out and do something better, account for all this value. That's where it's been most successful. So really encourage you to do what you can at the state level to make that clear as an expectation for your commission.
All right. Great. Well, I know we're at time. I'll pass it to you, Kara, to close out. I know we had a question too on storage. I tried to answer that in the chat and happy to follow up with you, Josh, offline too. I'll put my email there. But yeah, Kara,
Thanks.
over to you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks so much for being here. For our final webinar in this expert webinar series on utility regulation in Kentucky, big thanks to Kent and Michael and Ted for sharing your expertise with us, and to Jeff and Claire and all of the team at RMI for making this whole webinar series possible. Would love to consider doing something similar again in the future. So if folks have ideas for other topics you'd like to explore, feel free to reach out and we'll see what we can do. And have a great Monday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks
Thanks,
so much for
everyone.
joining.
Thank you.